There are moments in history when silence becomes more dangerous than bullets. And what happened a few days ago in Tanzania was one of those moments. A president stood inside a military barracks in Dodoma surrounded not by her citizens but by soldiers. No children waving flags, no anthems sung together, only concrete walls, gun barrels, and applause that was later added by editors to fit the performance. That was not democracy. That was fear dressed as ceremony. As television cameras were forced to shoot from one narrow angle, the world saw a calm oath. But what the people of Tanzania saw and what they felt was something else entirely: tear gas on the streets, police dispersing crowds, and dozens who disappeared the night before the inauguration. And while that fear filled the air of Dodoma, the voice that broke through the silence came not from the East African coast, but from the heart of the Sahel, from a soldier who has become the conscience of a continent, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. In a powerful declaration, he asked the question many were too afraid to ask. When a president does not take the oath among her people, but between concrete walls and gun barrels, is that still leadership, or is that fear? His words echo beyond Tanzania. They cut through every capital where power has learned to hide from its people. So tonight we ask you, the viewers who have seen both the Cold War and the digital age, to look deeper. Is Africa's struggle today a reflection of something the entire world is becoming, where democracy is performed, not lived? If you believe that truth still matters more than appearances, subscribe, share, and stand with those who speak, even when it's dangerous to do so. The morning of that inauguration in Dodoma did not begin with songs or drums. It began with silence, the kind of silence that carries the weight of fear. Soldiers lined the roads before dawn, their rifles gleaming under a pale African sky. Steel fences surrounded the parade ground. Television crews were ordered where to stand and what not to film. The nation's broadcaster, once the voice of the people, went off air just 12 minutes into the ceremony, citing technical issues. But everyone knew it was not a failure of machines. It was a failure of courage. Inside the compound, Samia Suluhu Hassan, the woman who calls herself the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, stood before a small, hand-picked audience. There were no farmers, no teachers, no market women. Only uniforms, politicians, and bureaucrats whose eyes stayed fixed on their scripts. The applause heard on television was not real. It was recorded, adjusted, and layered in post-production, as if democracy itself had to be edited before being shown to the world. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Dodoma was breathing smoke. Crowds of citizens had gathered, hoping to witness what they believed was their national day, only to be met with tear gas. Police trucks rolled in, mothers ran holding their children, dozens of protesters were dragged into vans. Some would not return home that night. Al Jazeera confirmed that the demonstrations were violently dispersed. Deutsche Welle reported missing persons. Amnesty International stated that media outlets and civil organizations were denied access for 72 hours. 72 hours of silence while the nation's image was being rewritten on state television. And Ibrahim Traoré watched, not as a distant politician, but as a soldier who had once stood among his people during chaos and refused to turn his guns against them. When he finally spoke, his words carried both fire and sorrow. A true leader takes the oath before their people. One who rules through fear takes the oath among guards. He did not speak as an enemy of Tanzania, but as a guardian of truth. He described what the cameras could not show: the trembling hands of officials, the forced smiles, the eyes darting toward rifles instead of the crowd. That was not a ceremony. He said it was a confession that power built on fear can no longer stand before its citizens. In the days that followed, Tanzania's government tried to dismiss his remarks as foreign interference. But Traoré's words had already struck a chord. They echoed across radio stations in Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and Malawi, places where people began to ask, are our own leaders any different? For many Africans, it was not about Tanzania alone. It was about the growing distance between the governed and those who claim to govern. It was about leaders who build fortresses of fear and call them palaces. It was about how democracy, once a promise, had become a performance. In Dodoma, the national broadcaster replayed the edited ceremony, trying to convince the people that the day had been peaceful. But on the ground, citizens were still washing tear gas from their faces. Churches and mosques quietly opened their doors for the wounded. In Dar es Salaam, young people began sharing footage on social media, whispering, "This is not the Tanzania we were promised." And so the story traveled from the fenced barracks of Dodoma to the digital screens of an awakening generation. What was meant to be a private ritual of power had become a public mirror of fear. And in that reflection, Ibrahim Traoré saw not just Tanzania's crisis, but Africa's truth, that the greatest threat to freedom is not the strength of dictators, it is the silence of the people. When Ibrahim Traoré's words reached the airwaves, they spread like thunder across the continent. At first, a few state broadcasters tried to mute him, calling his speech provocative, but the people had already heard. Clips of his address flooded WhatsApp groups, radio stations, and community halls. His voice, deep and measured, became the echo of what millions had been afraid to say out loud, that fear had replaced faith across Africa. And that is when the reaction began. In Kenya, the government congratulated Samia Suluhu within hours of her secret inauguration. President William Ruto sent a message praising the democratic process in Tanzania. But the people of Kenya answered him publicly, flooding his account with thousands of replies. "You speak of democracy while praising a dictator. You talk of African unity while ignoring our brothers being tear-gassed." The comment sections became protests of their own, a digital rebellion led not by soldiers, but by citizens armed with truth. In Uganda, President Yoweri Museveni called Suluhu's victory a testament to the people's faith. The reply came instantly bitter and sharp, birds of the same feather flock together. That phrase trended for 2 days straight, turning into an indictment of leaders who had traded integrity for convenience. Across Zambia, Malawi, and Ghana, the same hashtag rose, "Not not in my name." Ordinary people, from students to shopkeepers, began posting simple messages. "Do not use our voices to legitimize tyranny. We stand with the people, not with power." It was the first time in years that citizens across borders spoke as one, not in the language of diplomacy, but in the language of dignity. But Traoré didn't stop there. He named the truth that few dared to touch, the reason behind the silence of African leaders. They did not close their eyes because they were unaware, he said. They closed them because they dared not lose. Each country, he explained, had something to protect. Zambia needs Tanzania's port of Dar es Salaam to export copper. Burundi depends on Tanzanian trade routes for survival. Mozambique needs military cooperation in Cabo Delgado to fight insurgents. Somalia fears losing aid if it challenges its allies. And Kenya, careful as ever, sent only the vice president to keep the diplomatic door open while avoiding the shame of standing beside a disputed ruler. That, Traoré declared, is not diplomacy. That is complicity. The people bleed while presidents shake hands. The people are arrested while leaders smile for the cameras. These lines became the heartbeat of the movement that followed. Street artists painted them on walls in Lusaka and Kampala. African students recited them at rallies and classrooms. His words transformed grief into a mirror, reflecting not only Tanzania's pain, but the moral decay of the continent's leadership. And then came the most powerful moment, the shift from anger to awakening. "They call it regional stability," Traoré said. "I call it betrayal." Those words burned through the illusion that silence equals peace. They tore apart the polite vocabulary of diplomacy and replaced it with something raw, something honest. For decades, Africa's leaders have feared instability more than injustice, but Traoré exposed a deeper truth, that there can be no stability built upon the suppression of truth. As his speech went viral, protests reignited across East Africa. In Dar es Salaam, youths began gathering at night, lighting candles for the missing. In Lusaka, a group of students marched holding a banner that read, "We are Africa, not colonies," trembling in fear. What began as a single voice from Burkina Faso had become a continental roar. And for the first time in years, even the silent began to whisper, "If we stay quiet while Tanzania is strangled, who will speak for us when our turn comes?" The question hung heavy, not just over Africa, but over the world, because Traoré had not merely condemned a president. He had named the disease that afflicts every government built on fear, and reminded a generation that silence too is a choice. When the smoke from Dodoma finally began to fade, what remained was not silence, it was suspicion. The people had seen too much and they could no longer pretend. The televised images of victory looked nothing like the streets they had walked, the fear they had felt, or the friends they had lost. Tanzania's political theater had succeeded in showing the world one picture while its own citizens lived another. Across the country, ordinary families whispered of those who had disappeared. Mothers carried photographs of sons who had gone missing before the inauguration. Local reporters terrified deleted footage from their cameras. Some church leaders urged peace, others could no longer hide their shame. In the cafes of Dar es Salaam, people lowered their voices when they mentioned the word democracy. It had become a dangerous word, and this is where Ibrahim Traoré's warning cut the deepest because he was not only talking about one country, but an entire pattern. He called it surrender of the mind before surrender of the nation. The West no longer needs armies to conquer, he said. They use advisors' development funds and humanitarian aid. He wasn't speaking in metaphors. He was describing a structure of dependence, one that had replaced colonial rule with financial chains. Foreign governments dictate which policies earn support, which reforms receive aid, and which elections are considered legitimate. Under that system, sovereignty becomes a performance, not a reality. The civil consequences are immense. When power hides behind soldiers, trust collapses. Citizens no longer see their government as their own. The young lose faith in voting. The educated lose faith in truth. And soon everyone begins to believe that silence is safer than honesty. That is how nations rot not from invasion, but from within. Traoré's words resonated because they revealed something people had long felt but could not articulate, that fear had become the true constitution of too many African states. The police no longer protect, they patrol. The media no longer inform, they perform. Parliaments debate without power. Citizens survive without voice. And so the political order begins to feed on itself. When a government fears its own people more than it fears injustice, it stops listening and starts defending not the nation, but itself. Buried inside Traoré's critique was a warning about the cost of that fear. It invites foreign control. Once a regime loses the ability to speak to its citizens, it starts to plead with outsiders for legitimacy, for loans, for approval. In that moment, sovereignty dies not in battle, but in negotiation rooms. When a fragile regime can no longer speak to its own people, Traoré declared it turns instead to plead with outsiders. And that is when the door to manipulation swings open. For the people, the result is despair, but also awakening. They begin to understand that freedom is not granted from above, but reclaimed from below. That is why, after the Dodoma crisis, Tanzanian youth began forming small civic groups online, anonymous, quiet, determined. They knew the risks, but they also knew something had already changed. Once a generation starts to remember, it cannot be made to forget. Fear had created obedience, but it had also planted resistance. And as Traoré's speech spread beyond borders, Africans began to see a reflection of their own struggles, from Lagos to Khartoum, from Kampala to Dakar. The true revolution was no longer fought with guns, but with awareness. Because when people learn to question again, the fortress of fear begins to crack. From Washington to Brussels, the official reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's speech was silence, the kind of silence that reveals unease. Western diplomats called his words divisive in private briefings, yet none could deny their power. For the first time in decades, an African leader had looked beyond his borders and accused the world of hypocrisy, and he did it not with threats, but with truth. To many Americans watching from afar, the story felt distant, another conflict on another continent. But beneath the distance lay something uncomfortably familiar. A government hiding behind security walls, the manipulation of television coverage, the branding of dissent as foreign interference. These were not uniquely African problems. They were the universal signs of democracy in retreat. Older Americans, those who remember the 1960s, could hear echoes of their own past. They remember how peaceful marchers in Selma were beaten for demanding the right to vote. They remember the protests during the Vietnam War, when patriotism was defined by silence. The same pattern repeats. Whenever truth becomes inconvenient, power calls it dangerous. And so Traoré's warning to Africa becomes a mirror for the West. When leaders fear their own people, he said, they stop being leaders. They become fortresses waiting to fall. For decades, Western nations have claimed to export democracy, yet they have funded governments that suppress it. Aid packages are tied to loyalty, not liberty. Humanitarian programs come with consultants who rewrite constitutions and shape economies to benefit the same few who already profit from Africa's pain. In truth, what Traoré described as the West's formula for chaos is not foreign policy, it is business. A business of instability, managed by think tanks and enforced by debt. But there is another layer, the moral one. America, once seen as the symbol of freedom, now faces its own erosion of trust. Many older citizens, those who grew up believing in the shining promise of democracy, now watch with disillusionment as media narratives grow narrower, as corporations and politicians trade truth for control. It is here that Traore's message hits home. Freedom is not a Western invention, it is a human instinct. When he says every phone is a torch, every citizen a camera, he is not just talking about Africa. He is talking about the new world we all live in, where technology can expose lies faster than any government can hide them. To the American listener, his voice may sound revolutionary, even uncomfortable. But perhaps that is what truth is meant to sound like. It forces reflection. It reminds us that democracy, whether in Dodoma or in Washington, survives only when power fears the people, not when people fear power. And as the world watches the rise of strongmen and the shrinking of free speech, Traore's declaration becomes more than an African warning. It becomes a question for us all. Have we too begun to take our oaths behind walls? There comes a time when history itself stops waiting. And for Africa, that time is now. Ibrahim Traoré's final words were not a speech. They were a warning wrapped in hope. Standing beneath the sun of Ouagadougou, he spoke not as a politician, but as a witness to an awakening. They may shoot at our chests, but they cannot shoot at the truth. They may cut the broadcast, but they cannot cut the path of light. Those sentences captured the heartbeat of a generation no longer afraid. Across the continent from Dar es Salaam to Dakar, young Africans began to realize that their silence was worth more to tyrants than their obedience. They understood what Traoré meant when he said that freedom is not a flag, it is a memory, a choice, and a voice. But this story is not Africa's alone. It is humanity's recurring test. Every age has its fortress built from fear, guarded by propaganda, and justified by power. The question is always the same: will the people inside that fortress awaken before it collapses? For those of us watching from afar in America, in Europe, across oceans, it is tempting to see this as a distant drama. Yet every democracy weakens in the same quiet way when citizens trade truth for comfort and when nations begin to confuse order with justice. Traoré's message calls each of us back to something older than politics, the moral duty to remember. He reminds us that every empire, every government, every generation reaches a point where silence becomes complicity. And at that point, it is no longer enough to be informed. One must choose to be awake. So let us ask ourselves, as he asked his continent, if we stay silent while one nation is strangled, who will speak when our turn comes? The answer begins not with leaders, but with us, the citizens who still believe that truth once spoken can still change the course of history. If you feel that freedom is still worth defending, if you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's courage reflects a deeper truth about our shared humanity, please share this message. Let it travel farther than fear. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because somewhere tonight, behind walls and fences, another leader is taking an oath. And somewhere else, a people are preparing to rise.